Now this time, perhaps betrayed by my own hubris, I'm going to go ahead and straight up call what is going to be next week. Because, you know, there is 12 affixes in the game. The only 2 affixes that are left, and the only 2 affixes that we haven't seen yet. One is, of course, explosive, and the other one is sanguine. So, next week is going to be tyrannical, sanguine, and explosive. Good day. Good day and good reset. Good new reset. I hope you have gotten your luck from the Great Vault, because I certainly did not. Once again, what we are talking about today is a couple of important things happening this week, at the start of this week. One is, of course, the question mark that we have had for now 6 or so weeks up to this point, which is the new combination of affixes which we are going to get every week. As mentioned, Mythic Plus has a new season and has new combination of affixes every week, and we don't know what's gonna be up, so every week we are discovering something new. But more importantly, before we get to that, this is the week you are getting to 57 renown, which means it's the end of your chase of character power. So this is as far your Soulbind 3 expansion is going to get. Renown will go all the way up to level 80, way more weeks before you actually finish the renown chase, but it's not gonna be tied to power anymore. It's just gonna be a bunch of titles, mounts, transmogs, and whatnot. The renown needed for unlocking all of your Soulbind is ending this week at renown 57. Last week, we have gotten the first 4 Soulbinds, 1 for each covenant, with the last trait available, and then this week we are getting the remaining 2/3. So 8 of the Soulbinds are getting their final capstone trait. Which means the question now is, are any of these powerful? Are any of these going to change something for your spec or your class, depending on what were you playing to begin with? Maybe you were playing something else. Maybe you were playing Pelagos just because you were waiting for Mechanicus to unlock its last trait. Maybe you were playing Emeni waiting for Marilet to unlock its last trait. Is there anything interesting in all of this? So we have to point out first the more disappointing ones. Okay, the ones that are not really going to change too much. They are going to be a minor / tiny increase, which is not going to change much of anything. And this is going to affect Fae and Venthyr. This is good. This is pretty good. Venthyr has gotten buffed over time. They now have, for example, Banus Druid moving over to Venthyr. You have gotten Rogues moving over to Venthyr. It has gotten way more representation than before. And Fae is good because Fae historically in this expansion has had the strongest default Soulbind trait powers. Yeah, sure, certain specs might have gotten to a different covenant, might have gone to a different Soulbind in a different covenant because they wanted the ability, the covenant ability, but the actual buffs you can get from the Soulbind 3s are, generally speaking, the strongest when you're going Fae. Particularly something we have touched on before multiple times, Korain when it comes to AoE, when it comes to Mythic Plus, has been the strongest one. And with this last remaining trait being unlocked, they don't gain that much power, which is cool because they were already strong to begin with. Nia is getting Bonded Hearts, which is a continuation of her initial trait, Grove Invigoration, which has a chance of giving you mastery whenever you heal or do damage, and then a guaranteed chance whenever you are using your Covenant ability. This extra capstone trait is basically going to give you, whenever the effect of Grove Invigoration healing an ally procs, and it heals a player not of your same covenant, the effect of your mastery increase from Grove Invigoration increases by 50%. All this to say, TLDR, not very good. Not very powerful, it's not going to affect too much. The other is Korain. This one is the opposite of what Korain already has, which is Wild Hunt Tactics. Wild Hunt Tactics is the very powerful, very Mythic Plus powerful trait that you can play when you're going for Korain, which is the one that gives you 10% more damage when you are damaging targets above 75% health, which is of course very good in Mythic Plus, right? You're moving pack from pack, so your initial burst with the cooldowns and maybe the trinkets and whatnot is empowered by 10% more damage because of Wild Hunt Tactics. Wild Hunt Stratagem is doing the exact same thing. So whenever you activate Wild Hunt Tactics, you gain a 1-minute buff. Whenever you are damaging a target below 35% health, Wild Hunt Stratagem is going to proc and give you 5% more damage for 10 seconds. So you're pulling a new Mythic Plus pack, all the enemies are at full HP, which means Wild Hunt Tactics is going to give you 10% more damage. Then the mobs will progressively go lower and lower in HP until they enter sub 35% range, at which point Wild Hunt Stratagem is going to proc and give you 5% more damage. This is poor in raids, it's poor on bosses, it's poor on single target, but it does give you some more powerful Mythic Plus DPS effectiveness when it comes to AoE. Trash mobs, you know, big packs. The other somewhat weak and disappointing one is Venthyr, because Venthyr you gain Fatal Flow from Nagia, which is essentially at the end of Euphoria, which is the Thrill Seeker buff that gives you 20% haste, you gain 20% increased critical strike chance or versatility, whichever you currently have more of, for 10 seconds. The reason why it's not too good is because, number one, Thrill Seeker, so the buff you get from Nagia, stacks up once every 2 seconds. So it takes you essentially a minute to proc this. You have no ways of making it go faster or slower or making it line up with your cooldowns, it's just automatic. So it's not as simple to line up cooldowns with this, but what's worse is that the extra 20% buff you are gaining from this capstone trait happens at the end of Thrill Seeker, so after you have lost the 20% haste buff. As you know by this point, if you play WoW, stacking cooldowns on top of each other is very powerful. That's why you want to use your cooldown, your potion, your trinket, and your bloodlust all at the same time. So gaining 20% haste from Thrill Seeker, then it ends, and then after that you gain 20% crit, it's not as powerful. It's likely, for example, your cooldown or your trinket will not last as long, or the phase in which you want to burst down a target will not last as long, so the effects, the double effect, first the haste and then the crit or the versatility, is not going to be as powerful. The other one, which is somewhat weak, is Draven. Draven is not generally used very often, particularly by non-tanks, and this effect is fine but not great. Each nearby enemy trembles at your presence, increasing your damage and healing done by 1% and reducing damage taken by 1% up to a maximum of 3 enemies. Again, in single target fights, this is just a pathetic 1% increase. Whenever you get at least 3 enemies, sure, it can be a 3% increase, which is standard for a powerful trait. So it's certainly better in Mythic Plus and in any fight where you can guarantee 3 at least enemies being up for a good amount of time. But in general, it's not very strong. The covenants that are getting some power with these unlocks are going to be Necrolord and Kyrian. Necrolord is a long-awaited one because Necrolord has gotten historically very bad traits. Blizzard has tried to buff a few of them, but even then, it was pretty poor. The few specs that are going Necrolord are mostly doing so because they want the ability, so the Covenant ability, and not because the trait themselves are powerful. They are, in fact, shit. Necrolord for a long time couldn't even break the 3% damage increase in all of its traits, whereas other traits like both Corraine and Nia could get to 4, 5, even 6% in some of them, whereas Necrolord was always bad. Kevin's Oozling is what you're getting for Marilet, is going to be breaking the 4 or even the 5% damage increase now for specs using Necrolord. In general, something like Unholy Decay, Elemental Shaman, Shadow Priest, so this one is going to be a good one. Whenever you use your Covenant ability, you're going to spawn an Oozling to fight alongside you. The duration of the Oozling is going to be based on the cooldown of your Covenant ability, obviously. The longer the Covenant ability's cooldown is, the longer the Oozling is going to stay alive. His attacks is going to cause your enemies to take 6% additional damage. So 6% damage increase during what ideally would be your burst, because that's when you use, generally, your Covenant ability. So that's a good one. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Hyremir doesn't get something quite as good. Hyremir gets another one of that somewhat boring 3% increase, which we have seen already. Many of the Soulbinds at this point are going to have a version of this. In this case, there is a little bit of a twist, but the result is the same. When you damage an enemy that's below 35% health, 3% of the damage done is repeated over 5 seconds. So it's basically an extra 3% damage during execute, during low HP of the target. Luckily, This is not single target capped. It doesn't stop at a single target. So even when you're AoEing, for example, in Mythic Plus, this bonus is going to be up and available. So at least it has better effectiveness on multi-target, as opposed to Kevin's Oozling, for example, which doesn't have AoE attacks. So the 6% increase from the Oozling will only affect one target. This one at least can hit multiple targets. Lastly, we have Kyrian. The main star this week of Kyrian is going to be Mechanicus. The Pelagos one is okay. Newfound Resolve is going to give you basically this minigame where a doubt will spawn for 10 seconds, and if you look at the mob spawning, the untargetable mob spawning, you're going to gain 10% primary stat and stamina for 15 seconds. The real powerful one is Mechanicus, which is the Effusive Anima Accelerator. This is the one that can reduce the cooldown of your Kyrian class ability by 4 seconds per affected enemy. And this scales up with the duration of your Covenant ability. So for example, Kindred Spirits only has a 1 minute cooldown, which means the possible cooldown reduction is all the way up to 20 seconds. But Priest, for example, has Boon of the Ascended, which has a 3 minute cooldown, so the possible cooldown reduction is all the way up to 60 seconds. So this is, the one that can create the most chaos amongst the balance, because of course it can reduce the cooldown of a big important ability. In this case, there aren't many huge Kyrian abilities. You have Paladins with Divine Toll, which has a 1 minute cooldown. You have Hunters with Resonating Arrow, since now we have more and more Hunters going Kyrian. That is also just a 1 minute cooldown. The bigger one, as mentioned, is Boon of the Ascended for Priest, which can go all the way up to a 1 minute cooldown extra, so it can be a pretty powerful one. Even more so, this goes without saying, in Mythic Plus, where you can almost always guarantee that you can hit 5 targets and get yourself a 1 minute cooldown discount on your Covenant ability. So that's a pretty good one. So this is what you are getting this week once you are finishing the story and getting your renown and getting all of your Soulbinds unlocked. The other thing that you're getting this week, what you're getting is a lie, because this guy, something like 10 days ago or so, lied to you. This guy said this. Now this time, perhaps betrayed by my own hubris, I'm going to go ahead and straight up call what is going to be next week. Because, there is 12 affixes in the game. The only 2 affixes that are left, and the only 2 affixes that we haven't seen yet. One is, of course, Explosive, and the other one is Sanguine. So, next week is going to be Tyrannical, Sanguine, and Explosive. Okay, fine, hold on. In his defense, I'm not biased here, I'm not trying to shill for this guy, which is a great content creator, by the way. The problem in his defense is that if you actually look at the available affixes, indeed, before Sanguine and Storming, that apparently are happening this week, the only 2 remaining ones we had not seen yet were Sanguine and Explosive. Yet, in a dramatic turn of events, in an amazing twist, subverting our expectations, we are actually just delaying the arrival of Explosive for whatever reason. So we are getting a second coming of Storming. After being up the first week with Bursting in Fortified, this week we have Storming again on Tyrannical. I am actually still half convinced this is a mistake. This wasn't even supposed to happen, and it was totally supposed to be Explosive, but Blizzard messed up. Otherwise, it would be pretty funky. So not only we are moving from certain affixes being on Tyrannical last season being moved to Fortified this season and vice versa, we are now also getting this within the same season. We are now getting a Storming in Fortified followed by a Storming on Tyrannical, just because. So this opens up for way more possible combinations. So I'm not gonna make any more calls about the possible combinations. I mean, the guy in the clip is not going to make any more wrong calls about combinations. So this week is an amazing week then. It would have been an amazing week with Sanguine and Explosive, because honestly, it's pretty simple, but now it's even more so, because Storming is even more manageable than Explosive. It has even less issues than Explosive. You're not getting punished for pulling multiple targets, especially now that the Stormings are capped per player, and if you get hit once by the Storming disappears. It doesn't linger. So Storming has been nerfed. Because of this, it's much more manageable. There are sure going to be some annoying periods in cramped situations like, of course, the good old Sanguine Depths Gauntlet, but besides that, Sanguine Storming seems to be an amazing week, especially considering that Sanguine is already somewhat punishing, more punishing at least, towards melee DPS. So, as usual, the best practice here is to just dump all the melee DPS on the bench, play with 3 range, ignore Storming, mostly ignore Sanguine, and you have a free week when it comes to trash. When it comes to trash mobs, you can pull as big as you want, no real issue there, and just go crazy. So it is a pretty good week when it comes to pushing Mythic Plus this week. Now, to end the video, I noticed with all of the things going on at Blizzard recently, as well as me trying other games, that I have neglected a little bit the current state of the meta, looking at some of the changes to both Raid and Mythic Plus. So those will come in the next few days to get us a little bit of an update, and then eventually I have decided to keep things fresh, mostly for myself actually, to go and have some sort of face-off, to have some sort of duels between specs. We're gonna go over and analyze how these specs have been doing in this season, because it's much more broad to make a video about, you know, hey, how are the specs doing in Raid this week? How have they progressed? And sometimes you spend a minute, maybe a couple of minutes on a certain spec. Hey guys, assassination is rising, assassination single target damage is better because of this legendary. And then that's it. Move on to the next. We have to talk about 35 different specs, so it's got to be quick. So this new type of video is going to allow us to focus certain specs a little bit more. Something like Frost Mage versus Arcane Mage. Something like Assassination Rogue versus Arms Warrior. Maybe even Holy Paladin versus Restoration Shaman. It's going to allow us to go a little bit more in depth on some of the more popular specs and see how are they doing a little bit more in detail, rather than always having to talk about them in a much more grouped sense with all the other specs available. Yes, don't worry, there is going to be a Feral Druid versus Survival Hunter video. That eventually is going to come as well, once we reach 85,000 subscribers. Now, thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to enjoy more of this content, you have to fight the YouTube algorithm with comments, likes, and subscriptions. So continue fighting the good fight. Thank you guys anyways, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, I am sure some intern about to be fired fucked up some code and pushed out Storming instead of Explosive. This is just a big misunderstanding.